Welcome to Let's Get Writing. I'm your host, Catherine Taylor. Let's Get Writing is all about the writing process from creation to publication. And here is where we share the stories behind the stories and bring life to books. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel at Catherine Taylor TV, and we'll keep you informed of all our new episodes. My guest this week is the author of one book of poetry called Soak, and also of two nonfiction books, Rock, Paper, Sex, The Oldest Profession in Canada's Oldest City, and most recently, Rock, Paper, Sex, Volume 2, Trigger Warning. Both books are published by Breakwater Books, and her exhaustive research into the sex trade industry in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador is shedding new light on a very controversial subject. Join me in welcoming Kerri Cull to Let's Get Writing, and I'll bring her right up in the screen. Welcome, Kerri.
Hi, thank you, Catherine. How are you?
Good. And you are in the oldest city in Canada, St.
Yes,
John's.
I am.
And I'm in central Newfoundland, Grand Falls, Windsor. So it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, yes, we're here to talk about your most recent book, Rocks, Paper, Sex, Volume 2, Trigger Warning. But I think we'll also be touching upon the first book as well. But the first question that came to my mind, Kerri, was Rock, Paper, Sex. Where did you get this title?
Well, the title, I had come up with a number of titles for the first book, and I was going back and forth between quite a few. And then I wanted to really make reference to the Rock, Newfoundland and Labrador. You know, Newfoundland is known as the Rock, so I really want to make sure that was in there. This is not a book about sex work and human trafficking across Canada. This is about Newfoundland and Labrador, St. John's area particularly. So I wanted to make reference to the Rock. Paper is a euphemism for money, and of course, the sex part.
And you covered it all in there. I just put the images up while you were talking, and I'm just going to pull that down now and see more of you. There we go. So, two books. You started, I believe it was in 2017 or maybe a little longer when you started writing these books?
Yeah, so I started the research for Volume 1 in 2014, the fall of 2014. And it took about 3 years to the date for publication of that. So from the idea to actual book in hand, about 3 years. And then I started writing the second volume late 20 or early 2018, I think. And yeah, it took 3 or 4 years for that one as well. So I started Rock, Paper, Sex Volume 1. I was actually inspired to do that. I went to a writer's retreat, and the facilitator, I was there for fiction at the time, but I went to a writer's retreat, and the writer, the facilitator, Gerard Collins is his name. He's a fantastic writer. He has a number of books out as well as an award-winning author. And he gave me and the other participants some really good advice. And he said, you know, write about what provokes you, write about what you have strong feelings about, or write about what you have questions about. And at the same time, in the news in St. John's, there were news articles about sex workers being gang raped at downtown hotels. And so I was thinking about that, and I was very angry about that, and thinking about what these people had gone through. And I started to, invoke all of these feelings in me and questions. So I took that idea and that interest in that subject and ran with it at that time. And now we're here two books later.
2 books later. And I can imagine, and the reason I wanted to talk about both books is because I would think the first book might have been the most challenging to write, given that you were out of the gate on this subject, which a lot of people don't even want to acknowledge, let alone research. And your approach is unique in that you approach the workers and you have to they have to allow you to tell their stories.
Yeah.
So Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that process. You had the idea, and then, how did you begin?
Yeah. So I didn't have a plan when I began the research for the first book. It was just read everything that I possibly could from all over the world, government documents, books, whatever I can get my hands on. And then I just put a call out for interviews. So I did that in a number of ways. I put an ad up on NL Adult saying, I am a woman looking to research the sex industry in St. John's. I'm looking for all kinds of stories. If you are someone who wants to talk to me, please, email me here. So I did that a couple times throughout the research process for the first book. I put up old school paper posters in strip club bathrooms. I went about it in a number of different ways. The second book, the research was very, very different because I had learned from the mistakes that I had made in the first book. But also from the first book coming out, and then, when I was writing the second book, I had a lot of connections made at that point, a lot of experiences under my belt in regards to developing relationships with people who are in the sex trade, or people who are survivors of human trafficking. I had done a lot more learning in various ways, talking to people informally, learning formally, and I really applied all of that to the second book. So the writing of the second book was much easier.
Mm-hmm. You had already established relationships, I guess, but
Yeah.
the trust element, because typically people working in that industry are not inclined to open up to anyone. How did you develop that trust? How did you reassure them to, and talk
People
about
ask me that quite a bit, and I don't really have a definitive answer for that. All I can say is that, when I was soliciting people for interviews, or when people were approaching me, asking me about my project, I was just always completely honest about it. And I didn't try to push anybody. So, for instance, if I sensed that someone was a little nervous about contributing or participating or talking to me, ultimately a stranger who could do anything with their story or this information, or, out them, leak their identity, that sort of stuff. I really gave people multiple outs to not participate. I didn't try to pressure anyone. And I never would want someone to participate in a project like this if they felt pressured. So, some of the stories came really easily in that people were just really happy to finally tell their story in a way where they could remain anonymous, but they could still have their honest story out there in the world, because a lot of these individuals have never told their story before. And I don't even mean publicly, I mean like to no one in their lives, right? So being able to do that was huge for some of them. And then, some others just wanted to, it was more of a cathartic thing for them, helping with their recovery, taking some of their power back. So there's different reasons why people participated. And when it comes to the trust factor, I had a few people ask me if I was a cop, and no, obviously I said, no, my God, I'm not a cop. I am interested in the legal frameworks and so on around these sorts of topics, but I'm definitely, not anyone that's involved with the regulatory body. And people also asked me if I was a journalist. Not a journalist. So those were some typical questions that I got. And I think if I had been affiliated with, a bigger media company or something like that, I don't think it would have been as easy for me to get these people to participate. But I think once they realized that I was just a woman who was coming at it from a storytelling perspective, someone who was interested in women's stories and empowering women to use their voices in various ways to educate people, I think that was one of the things that really spoke to people, and they realized that, okay, this is just a regular person who's interested in my story and wants to help me tell it for a myriad of reasons that I'm okay with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess you were entrusted with telling the story the right way.
Yeah.
And you mentioned to me that once you transcribed or created these stories, that they could still have a voice in that they
Yes.
had to prove it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that process, so the first time I did that process for the first book, I went about it all wrong in that I would do an interview, then I would transcribe the interview, and then I would wait like a year to write the story, which was a really, really horrible idea because I wanted to go back to these participants and give them the opportunity to edit their stories. And of course, I wanted everybody to give consent to have their story published and so on, and make sure that they were represented the way that they wanted to be represented. So you can only imagine now if you gave an interview 2 years ago about something deeply personal, and then someone sends you this email like, oh, here's your story, quoting you from 2 years ago. Of course, you would probably want to edit that. You may not even want to participate anymore, things like that. So I had a host of things like that come up. So when I did the second book, I learned from that. What I did was I really spent time on one story at a time. So I would do the interview, I would do the transcription as quickly as possible. And then I would write the story and I would liaise with that participant very, very soon after we did the interview. And I would usually be communicating with them in that interim anyway, just to make sure that they were okay and they were still feeling good about the process and being involved. But yeah, I definitely learned from that mistake from the first one, and I corrected it in the second one, and it made for a way easier and more efficient interview, transcription, writing process.
A good tip for anyone thinking about a project of this nature.
Yes. Yeah.
Are interviewing and getting commentary from people. Things change. And particularly, I would say in that industry, there would be a lot of change. You mentioned earlier how, telling the story was a big step for people because many of these people don't even tell their own families that they're involved. So it's something to bring out would be a big step for them. And so I've learned a lot by reading the book, and that's one of my questions. What did you expect people to take from this book? What is your hope?
Well, with the first book, I just wanted to shed light on stories that affect women and kind of just get people talking about issues that I think should be normalized. And I think that certainly happened with the first book. After the first book, you could hear people talking about sex work and human trafficking, like in forums where you wouldn't normally hear people talk about those sorts of things. And then what I saw later was that conversations were starting to be normalized around other topics that, yes, this might be a book about sex work and human trafficking, but it's also a book about consent and harm reduction and intimate partner violence and equality and feminism and motherhood and all of these other things. So I feel that the book has really helped normalize these sorts of conversations around dinner tables between couples and all of that. And maybe not pleasant conversations sometimes, but has definitely provoked some of those conversations that I think are necessary for us to learn and grow together. But I think if I had to say, a goal, what I wanted people to get out of these books is just in regards to the way that society and the laws treat sex workers, and also all the stigma that's attached to all of the different things that can happen to people who are involved in this industry and survivors of human trafficking. There's a lot of stigma and shame and guilt and all of these things. So that's kind of what I want to shed a light on a little bit more of, is to educate people on what that's like for individuals, and also so that when laws are being written and legislation is being written around these topics, that there is another resource out there that is built on the voices of people with experience that can be referenced. Because I feel like when we are writing laws, when it comes to how to protect women and minorities, when it comes to sex work, when it comes to human trafficking, all of that, I feel like we really need to listen to the people of experience, and those voices are the ones that should be most prominent in the decision-making process.
And which are most often absent from any decision-making process around that. And I think quite often people don't want to talk about these issues, maybe from a place of ignorance or lack of understanding. And I think your books help educate, certainly bring information to people, a place where they can say, okay, this is from the perspective of people who are in this industry. And once you understand that, it's easier to ask questions. It's easier to bring forth a position. But also, am I correct in saying, I mean, you mentioned human trafficking, you've mentioned the sex trade, but are they not, I guess they're intertwined. There's just no way. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm trying to sort that out because there are people who choose to go into this, that it is the career that they want. They're very comfortable and very happy working in it. And then there are the people who are brought into sexual slavery, don't have choices, who are being trafficked. So how do we understand this in making any decisions? And
This is
confusing.
This is the big thing, right? This is why a lot of people have problems with the laws that currently exist, is because, those, let's say, two things, just to make it very kind of clear to understand. Obviously, it's very muddy and fuzzy the way that these things intersect, but just for clarity purposes, if you're talking about someone who is a sex worker by choice on one end of it, and someone who is a victim or survivor of human trafficking on another, their stories are often vastly different in many ways, but there is that really wide intersection there somewhere along the way. And it is very hard to, for me personally, I mean, I can't speak for everybody and everyone has their own opinions about this, but for me, talking to all of these different people, women, trans people, men, like talking to all these different people who have been involved in some way, it's very hard to come down on one side or the other for me. Like, I really think about this in regards to the individual. And, and when I'm talking to someone, I am fully engaged and immersed in their story in a way that, makes me fully immersed and engaged in the way that they're thinking about it and their opinions and their feelings, right? So when it comes to those two kind of opposing spaces of the same world, it is very difficult to navigate. And if it's very difficult to navigate for someone like me who's done so much research and talked to so many people, and I have friends on both sides. I have friends who are survivors of human trafficking. I have friends who are independent sex workers. So it is extremely hard for me to balance those conflicting spaces. I will say that there is, or there seems to be, definitely a line throughout all of the people, or most of the people that I interviewed, in that, everyone feels that there is not enough being done to protect victims of human trafficking. There's not enough being done in regards to services to help people, not just Newfoundland and Labrador, but across Canada as well. And also that the people in my book, the local people who I've interviewed, they almost without question, I can't even think, I'm just trying to go through all of them now. There's been a lot of people that I've talked to, but I think I can safely say that most of the people that I interviewed, they believe that this is the type of work that should not have a boss. So that is definitely one of the defining themes that are coming out of these voices, is that it should be something that someone is wholly responsible for and independent of themselves. They should be able to sell services the way they want to sell them, and they should be in control of their body and their money, and it should not be controlled by anybody else.
That's interesting to hear that, because there are parlors and massage parlors and places like that where people work, and my first instinct is to think, well, it would be safer in an environment like that, because you're not alone and somebody knows where you are and who you're with, and there's some tracking for who goes in and out. So to hear that they would prefer the independence is interesting. I probably would.
Well, some people feel that working in a massage parlor that would still count as independent. And they wouldn't consider the person that runs the massage parlor to be a pimp or anything like that. So, and in a lot of cases, the massage parlor atmosphere is safer than other options. It depends on the individual and their circumstance and what their needs are.
Mhm. And when I see that in many instances, a lot of the stories people have mentioned that if I had to work at a minimum wage job, I would barely survive. Where in this industry, I actually can have a decent standard of living and time to do things I want to do. In fact, some of the stories were people who were going through university and that this was a way for them to fund it. So I'm not sure that people think about these things, that there is a financial need. And you talked mainly about women, and that can become a bigger issue in the world today, how women can support themselves and live. The world is increasingly expensive, as
It
we know
is.
after COVID and or during COVID. I guess I shouldn't jump ahead too far, but it's the way that they can earn a living where they can survive, and it keeps them there. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, if you think about, I just think about, when I was, traveling and I was in Ireland and I went to the Kilmainham jail there and did the tour like a lot of people do. And, there's stories there about back in the Great Famine, men were leaving their wives and their children because they couldn't provide for their families. So women had to resort to sex work at that time to feed their children. And that was kind of the one thing a woman could do then to make money to feed her children. And, we're talking about, 150 years ago or whatnot, right? So I feel like if we have a problem, a moral problem with someone making the choice to sell their own sexual services, we really have to take a deeper look at the systemic problems that revolve around women, inequality and pay equity, and all of these things that only now are being talked about in any sort of real and honest way. But this has been something obviously that's been going on for many, many years, and it's a systemic problem that I don't think is just about sex work. Sex work might be the result, but I think there's a host of other historical and political things that have culminated to this particular point.
Yeah, and it's always been with us. I know your book primarily talks about women, but we do know that men are also involved. Are men involved, as sex workers? Is it a much smaller number or portion?
It seems to be that way. From what I gather, it definitely seems to be that way. It's just like the majority of buyers are men, the majority of sellers are women. There are definitely a lot of trans sellers as well. So there's a lot of different kinds of people who are selling sex work. It's mostly men that are purchasing, from what I gather.
Mm-hmm. And also in the book, there was one story where from the point of view of a wife who had discovered her husband had this whole other life in which he was very much a participant in the sex trade.
Yes.
And she discovered that and had to learn to live with that. So there's a lot of perspectives in your books to open your eyes. And one of the things that I think is very important for us to mention, the subtitle on this book, Trigger Point.
Trigger warning.
Or trigger warning. One of the first things I said to you, well, why is that on the cover? And I think we should address that, why it is.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of reasons why I chose trigger warning for that subtitle. And one was because I did not put a trigger warning on my first book, and I should have. So I wanted to make sure that I did not make that same mistake, kind of a blatant throwback to the mistake and one of the mistakes of the first book. And then another reason why I did it is because my book does need a trigger warning. There are some very graphic stories in there and some very graphic parts of stories. So some of the stories are funny and lighthearted. There are a bunch that are kind of right in the middle, and then there are some that are very dark. So the book definitely needs to be approached with some discretion. And like I say in the introduction, this book is not for everybody. Maybe you shouldn't read it, right? Because there is that very a heavy, dark mental part of it that is not for everybody. So it definitely does need a trigger warning. And I do have a mental health crisis line information peppered throughout the book for anyone who is in need of some guidance when they're thinking about all of this. Another reason why I call it trigger warning is because I just kind of wanted to make a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that phrase is used a lot right now and very flippantly. And I don't know if everybody understands what a trigger warning actually is used for. So a trigger warning, I think sometimes people use a trigger warning to say that something is, very offensive or I don't know, very, very graphic or something like that. But something that is triggering to me is not necessarily triggering to you, right? So for instance, as someone who has not been sexually assaulted, I'm not going to I don't have a trauma brain to go back to, or a place in my mind, a place in my brain that is trauma bound. If I'm reading something like that, yes, I might find it very hard to read and very emotional, but I'm not going to be triggered to a place of trauma. Whereas someone who has been sexually assaulted, they may be triggered and they will go back to that trauma place in their brain. And that may affect them very deeply and in a very big way for who knows how long. So I just kind of wanted to put trigger warning on the cover to draw attention to that so people can learn more about what a trigger warning actually is.
Yeah, a good idea with a book like this. Also in the book, before we wrap, Blue Door, you volunteered with this organization, and maybe people don't know what this organization is. So I'd like you to explain that to people.
I would love to talk about Blue Door. Yeah, so there are a lot of different services in St. John's that helps sex workers and that helps women who are involved in the sex trade, whether they are independent sex workers or survivors of human trafficking and everything in between. Blue Door is one that I've had a very close relationship with over the past couple of years. I've done writing courses or volunteer writing programs with the participants that I loved, and I have developed relationships with a lot of the women there, a lot of the participants there. And what Blue Door does is they help people who have been exploited. They help people who are victims of sexual exploitation. They help them move away from the industry. And that is a very long, complicated process, as you can imagine, for an individual, depending on the variety of factors that are in play there.
I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And for folks who are watching, thank you so much for joining us. All the shows are available on Catherine Taylor TV on YouTube. Have a great day, and we'll see you again next week.